Ting. QuickTime Player. New audio. Come on. New audio recording. All right, ready?
Yep.
God, you ready?
Yep.
All right. 3, 2, 1. All right.
All right.
Hello, and welcome to the podcast. My name is Jess Chadwick.
Todd Slider.
And I'm Chris Gomez.
And we are your hosts. Today is September 15th. In other words, we are recording this on September 15th. I'm already okay.
But you won't listen to it on September 15th.
No.
No.
This is already gone horribly wrong.
Do you want to start over?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
cool.
no.
Oh, God.
I don't. You know what? When I do my lynda.com course, I literally script every single fucking word.
Then you should do that.
True.
Except that you can't do it now because it's 10:59 p.m.
I know. And I already bought a domain name. All right.
You also didn't say Static Void Podcast.
All right.
No. I was waiting for you to do that, so I.
All right. Okay. Here we go. Okay.
Recording.
Ready? 3, 2.
No, wait. I didn't stop the recording. Is that?
Oh my God.
Is that a thing?
Stop it.
Yes.
Restart.
Okay.
Create a new one.
All right.
Create a new one. Ready?
No, I'm doing it. I'm not much of an Audacity user here. Okay.
think we
Cool. All right. I think I'm good.
Ready?
Yes.
3, 2, 1.
Hello, and welcome to the Static Void Podcast. I'm your host, Jess Chadwick,
This is Todd Slider.
And this is Chris Gomez.
and I'm not the only host. Let's do it one more time.
Oh.
I don't want to claim. I'm not going to be this anal. I'm just because we're fucking up in the beginning, we can easily start over. All right, I'm done. I'm done fucking up. I'm done being perfectionist. All right, hold on. Hold on.
There's humor in the realism of the podcast.
I know.
You should write a script. That way you can get through the first minute.
That's your
Yeah,
homework
okay.
next time.
All right. I should next time. All right. Ready? Oh fuck. Are we ready to hit record?
Yeah.
All right.
I'm not gonna
3,
curse.
2, 1, go. Hello, and welcome to the Static Void Podcast. I'm Jess Chadwick,
I'm Todd Slider.
And I'm Chris Gomez.
and we are your hosts. We are recording this on September 15th, and today we're going to be talking about the world of single-page applications and client-side MVC. But before we get into that, Chris, I hear you're doing some interesting stuff lately. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I've been playing around with ASP.NET 5. It's going to be coming out next year, Q1, and I thought it would be fun to try and figure out how it all works in Linux. So I've been getting that working on Ubuntu and CentOS, blogging about it on my blog, and it's interesting stuff. I mean, I don't know if I'm ready to use it today, but it works. It's kind of amazing.
Yeah, nice. I actually have some similar news too. My lynda.com course actually just went live a couple weeks ago, also on ASP.NET 5. And the interesting thing is, it took me 4 months to record that course, and so I'm recording the whole course in Beta 4. And 2 days later, 2 days after my course is actually released to the public, the team releases Beta 6, and everything is broken. And I have to.
Yeah,
that's
we're on Beta 7 now,
Yeah,
so there's that.
Yeah, that's living in the beta world. And I think in next week or something we're going to be on Beta 8.
Yes.
So yeah, I'm going to have to end up recording the entire thing early next year when it releases. But hey, it's cool. It's a good time, and it's definitely a good framework.
So you didn't learn from us reading a book and having the same problem, huh?
Yeah, right. So Todd, what have you been up to?
Well, been working with a lot of different companies and helping them understand the topic of our show tonight is what are single-page applications about. So part of what I do at work every day is help enterprises understand how to build single-page apps and decide if they want a framework, don't want a framework, how do they retrain their developers to be able to do this kind of stuff. Just helping people understand how to build single-page applications and get up to speed quickly.
Yeah.
Because they have to focus on building apps and not learning frameworks.
Yes.
Well, let's just jump right into it. That's a great segue. So I want to start off by saying at work we've banned the term single page application just because it's so off. I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree, Jess, is that the term started out, I think, because we were getting rid of the page refresh, right? We were getting rid of the click, especially if you were an IE user.
Mm-hmm.
And we're past that now. I mean, we're to the point where at least every website, we're expecting some of our interactions with the site to not require the whole thing to be re-downloaded from the server again. That's become pretty commonplace.
Yeah, I think it's building a better user experience. Basically, is what it's all about, right?
Yeah. I definitely hate that name too. It sounds more like you're selling hot tubs than actually building anything. So I prefer, when I talk to people about this, I just say it's modern web development. Like Chris was saying, every web application has this to a degree. It may not be a full-blown thing. Any application you're pretty much building for modern web, HTML5, those kind of things, they kind of fit in that same umbrella. And you have the same challenges and things you have to consider when you're starting out.
Well, so one of the reasons that we decided to talk about it on the show today is because it's really, really popular these days, right? And so, I mean, each of us have kind of our take on that, on why it's popular and what's good about it, what's bad about it. But I mean, it seems to be the silver bullet today. That's just kind of my take on it, right? But there are still some cases where it's not really necessarily the right thing to do. Have you guys run into that? Have you guys run into a situation where a team is really kind of looking to use SPA to solve a problem that's not really a good problem to solve with SPA? I mean, what are those cases? Those good and bad use cases for SPA.
For me, it's more about people over architecting a solution because they're trying to use a SPA than necessarily bad use cases for it. I mean, there definitely are cases where, I mean, if you're building a contact form and that's all you're really doing, it doesn't make sense to build a single page application. But in my experience, the bigger challenge is people not understanding where do I start or how do I do this. They're used to the world of web forms or PHP or even WordPress. They're used to the back-end frameworks that drives all their decisions. And now they're in a different world. They're on that client side, and they're like, well, where do I begin? What do I have to do to get started?
Yeah.
There's no file new HTML page in IE or in Chrome.
Right.
And that's probably the other big barrier, at least in our world, where Visual Studio is everything we live, right? It's this great IDE. It does all these great things for us. Now you're trying to build a modern web application, a SPA application. All of a sudden, you have to go and try to master Google Chrome tools or IE tools, whatever it is. That becomes your IDE more than Visual Studio. A lot of times, all I use Visual Studio to do is to host it easily in IS. I don't even need Visual Studio. I could use Sublime or something else to do my day-to-day job, but Visual Studio makes it easy enough to host it, so I still end up using it, even though I'm using 1/1000th of what Visual Studio does.
Yeah.
So it's a mind shift for people. They're used to that Microsoft sort of approach, where Visual Studio drives everything, or like I said, the framework drives everything, and now they're kind of, where do I start?
Well, so that's kind of
what
the developer experience, but what about the actual, the use cases, the applications? When has it not been a good fit? When has it been a really good fit? I mean, have you worked on applications where it's just been a really, really good fit and it really solved the problem?
I think that I've worked on some applications that were just forms over data, and so we used it partially because it's the thing to do, but I'm not necessarily sure that in that case there was always an advantage over just what we had before in ASP.NET MVC. Where it would come in handy though is you're working on this forms over data app, but then you get that design idea of even though we're basically just presenting some widgets to the user, I think it would be cool if they could move them around right here. They could reorder them right here on the page. And if you don't take advantage of the client-side experience, what are you stuck with? Are you going to be refreshing that page as they click around, as they move things back and forth? We've all may have still experienced today some websites that as you're filling out a form, have you seen this recently? As you're filling out a form and it goes to retrieve more options for you to fill in, it actually does a page refresh.
Yeah.
And that's frustrating. We all hate it. And
yeah.
so, you could say that there aren't good use cases for it if you're just doing a simple forms over data app until you get to the part of your app where you say, hey, I wish the user could do something immersive here with their mouse. Or if you're thinking ahead, that your user might actually be using this on an iPad, and they might want to drag these columns around. So you've just entered a space where, well, now I've got to be on client side. I can't expect ASP.NET MVC and certainly not web forms to do this for me.
Yeah, definitely. And that's, especially in my organization, we are really heavily adopting SPA lately, and it is largely to kind of solve our mobile use case. And it's really not mobile in specific, but it is really more of the eternal quest for write once, run anywhere, right? So we can write a desktop application and then host that application, or at least the components that make up that application, the parts that make up that application on an iPad, right, in a mobile application as well. And honestly, it's been working out pretty well for us. And I'm kind of looking at that mobile use case, as it really seems to be driving the huge adoption lately, or at least one of the big factors. I mean, are you guys coming across that? Is that what you're seeing, or
is that because you want a native mobile app to go alongside your desktop client web app, or is that's not what you're saying? You're saying mobile web apps.
Native is an interesting word.
Sure, sure, right.
You know,
also known as the frameworks that the phone, OS vendors want us to be using.
Yeah. I mean, there's some different technologies, which I'm sure we'll talk about in future episodes soon to come, that you can actually write your applications in JavaScript and maybe even in HTML and then compile them down into native code. But I'm really talking about more taking a web application and just wrapping it in a native container, so it is a native app. But once you open up that native app and initialize and everything, you just kick it off to the browser view, and then you're in a browser application. But it has a really native feel. So I think a lot of applications really fail at that. They take that same approach, and then they open up that web browser, and then you are in a web page, and it really feels and looks like a web page. But with these new frameworks, well, not even new frameworks, but with the frameworks in the state they're in today, you can build some really immersive experiences with HTML and JavaScript that feel native.
Right.
So I agree with you from the mobile experience. I definitely think mobile applications have driven the need, or why this is becoming more popular, even though for probably more than a decade we had the capability to do very similar applications. But for me personally, I live in a world where we do very high-end user experience. We actually have user experience engineers that go off and figure out the best experience. A lot of times what ends up happening, in order to make that work, we have to deal with state on the client. So that's really my decision point. So when I sit down, I say, all right, how much of the middle tier, the business logic, how much is that going to need to live on the client? And I'm going to need that level of interaction. And where my server becomes more of just a data access layer. That's the trigger that tells me, now I'm kind of moving down to that single page application model. And like you said, mobile almost requires you to do that, right? Because if it was still a web application, I could probably go back to the server 100 times if I wanted to. When I come over to a mobile application, I want that immersive experience, but I also have the case where, what if I get disconnected? Or what if the user needs to go offline for a period of time? Now I need that, right? If I was going back to the server wouldn't necessarily be there, so now I'd have run a lot of different problems.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like
mobile's definitely made it more mainstream, but it's something, for at least in the case of my case, we've been building these apps for 2 or 3 years, and the frameworks and other things we're working on are finally maturing enough to make it easier to do it. But it's something you definitely... Mobile is the only reason you needed to build single-page apps. And it shouldn't be the only reason you build single-page apps. The functionality of the application should drive that decision.
Is it that we've come to the point where we're saying we've got this powerful programming engine, which is the JavaScript engine, in our browsers, and we want to offload the work on the client, not because we're trying to achieve some kind of mainframe capability. It's that okay, you've got this ability to execute this code on your end, so why don't I keep the focus on your work that you're doing right now instead of coming back for a page refresh? Is that the difference? because when you think about the frameworks that we grew up with, whether it was classic ASP or it could be PHP or even if we fast forward to using Razor and ASP.NET MVC, it was all about writing code so that the web page could be put together, all of its bits formed on the server, and then we ship it down.
Fully rendered and then shipped down.
Yeah.
Yeah. To
rendered.
To me, single page application, client side application, rich internet application, whatever you want to call it, when the application lives on the client or whether or not it lives on the client, I have a pretty clear definition, and I tend to explain it as kind of a spectrum, right? So on the let's say it's the left-hand side, you've got the traditional completely server-side rendered, 100% server-side rendered application where all of the state needed to render that application lives on the server, and then on the other side, the right-hand side, you've got what is typically referred to as the SPA, the completely client-side state. In other words, it may interact with a server on somewhere else on the internet, right? Some backend somewhere, but those services, that server that it interacts with, are completely stateless, right? So all 100% of the state is on the client, and then you've got that spectrum in between there. And so when you take that completely server-side rendered application, then you start throwing some jQuery on it, making a little better experience, a little bit richer experience, you kind of start to blur the lines. But there is a certain point, somewhere in the middle where you do definitively kind of move over and you flip sides. You either you can only be one or the other. You can't be both. You can't have your application state on the server and on the client. One of them is going to own the state. It's going to be the system of record, or the master state. And then the other one may be synchronizing in some way to a certain extent, but one of them is truly going to own the state. And that's kind of the way that I think about it. The difference between server-side rendered and SPA. It's not a yes or no. It's not a Boolean. My app is server-side rendered or it's SPA, but where the state is a yes or no proposition. So I don't know if that kind of resonates with you guys, or.
I tend to think of these client-side applications as being, a facade over what's really going on at the server. If you've decided to have your single-page application talk to some form of web API, some form of web service, then the gatekeeper to the state is still the web service. I mean, because the next thing you have to realize is that anybody can open up our tools like Postman or Fiddler and send anything they want down to your server, right? So sometimes when I think of architecting these apps, I actually feel like the app is the API or the service, and that the front-end client is, I don't want to call it a thin facade, because let me tell you, they're not thin. They're very powerful and smart, because we want the user to be able to interact with them richly. But in the end, he's holding on to state while you're working on it, like you said, Jess, and then he's sending a representation up to the server saying, hey, the client flipped these widgets and moved these columns around. We need to save that for the future.
Well, I think it's also, for this conversation, it's very important to define what what we mean by state, right? So state is the application state, not necessarily the data that you're changing. So if you have an application that deals with customers, when you bring those customers down, that is the data that you've gotten from the server, and you may edit them in your application and then send them back to the server to update the server. That data, that information going back and forth, is not what we're talking about, right? That's the application itself, which customers it has, how many customers it has, the edits that are in progress, all of those things are the application state. And then what is actually persisted back to the database or the web API, or the database through the web API, that is more, I don't know what you guys call it, but data.
I call it transient
state. Yeah, transient state. You're still using that term state. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you bring up a good point, which is one of the big problems we have in software. We use the same name for 100 different things.
Oh yeah. Yep.
I just wanted to comment real quick on what you said. To me, when we make that switch, or the spectrum you talked about, it's not a one-size-fits-all. You may have an application where 80% of the application is one way and another part is something else. It isn't necessarily or condition. But we get back to state. To me, it's both. It is the data state, and it's also like you said, the application state, but it's also the business rules and things. That to me is the big difference. If I'm going to do this 10-layer calculation, I may now be doing that on the client to offer the best experience or to take advantage of what the client offers. I'm not going back to the server sending 30,000 rows of customers to then do a calculation of customers. I may bring down, I want someone to bring down 30,000 customers, but I'd bring down the state data I need for that experience, that what you guys are trying to do, work with it, and at some point I'm persisting it back. We're moving back to the client-server model. It's a good way to look at it. The server is the server. All it does is exist to persist stuff. And it may have business rules, from a security and other things. It still needs to do all those things, but the application itself, I refer to it as the 80-20 rule. 80% of your application is on the client now. 20% of persisting the data, business rules and things you may need to do because you want to make sure the data's in a good state, that's on the server too, but your application is the client.
Okay.
And then there's cases you could have where you may not even have a backend. You may be writing to the local cache because that makes sense for what you're trying to do.
Yeah, right. So we just spent the past 5 minutes talking about the server and the interaction of the server. So, I guess that leads to the question, what is the role of the server in client-side applications? Right? We're talking about single-page applications that run on the browser, and we just spent the past 5 minutes talking about the server. So what is the role? Clearly it's important. What do you think, Chris? What role does the server play in a single-page application?
I think we lost Chris. He's back. Ask the question again.
Sorry.
Did you hear?
No, because I had a cat that was starting to howl, so I apologize.
So just say yes and move on.
Right, I'll start over. So I said, what do you think is your what is the role of the server in a single-page application, Chris?
Well, so it depends on just as there are fads on the client, there's the popular things to do on the server, right? And there's the RESTful APIs, which basically say, here's what I'm going to do is instead of the old days, quote unquote, where I actually figured out the HTML that you wanted by applying the business logic that you were talking about, Todd. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, why don't you call me and just ask for the list of customers you're interested in, and I will verify that the request is valid and authorized and everything, and then send that to you. And then you on the client, hey, whatever you want to render. You want to render it in a pie chart? That's fine with me. You want to render it in columns and tables? Have a good time. Where in the past, it was we were writing our PHP or our Razor to say, oh, God, I got to build a pie chart now. So let me cook that all up and then ship the HTML down. So we're taking that load off the server, and it's not so much of a load. It's just we don't want to do that there anymore because we want the clients to be more flexible.
And more performant. If I had to, every time I wanted to change a pie chart, if I go back to the server, regenerate it, that's a big hit.
Well, so do you guys have any kind of guidelines or rules that you really adhere to when it comes to interacting with the server, or the role of the server and the role of the client? And are there any boundaries that neither should cross, and responsibilities that are squarely in one camp or the other?
Security squarely on the server.
Yes, definitely. Both are responsible. The server has to be secure.
Right.
I also take a look at it from the idea of I don't look at this is client, this is server. I say, what am I trying to do? And then I say, all right, what is the most efficient way to get this action going back and forth? Because I've been doing this for 2 decades, and the one thing I can never control is how fast the network is. I can't make that faster. I can do things on the server to make it faster. I can do things on the client to make it faster. I can't make it faster going across the wire. So one of the things I first say is, all right, I have this application. I have initial state I'm going to work with. Do I bring the application down and then go get that initial state, or kind of bring both down at the same time? And then as I go through the application, what Chris was talking about, I may get a list of customers and do a bunch of stuff to them. I'm not shipping it all back to the server. I'm just going to ship maybe the customers I need to or change or whatever I want to do. So a popular format to do that is JSON data, where 4 or 5 years ago we were using XML, and who knows, 2 or 3 years we might be sending binary data again. So there's a couple different decisions. Number one is, because you can't control that wire, you want to minimize that data going back and forth to only what you need. because ultimately you want the user's experience to be the best possible. So that's sort of my driving force. And that also drives into what frameworks and stuff I'm going to use, whether it's on the server or the client. Chris mentioned Web API a little while ago. That's a pretty good one because it's very efficient at serializing data into JSON. So that's sort of what my driving force from a application architecture point of view, from a framework point of view, is back to that raw, what do I need to get from the client to the server? What is my communication back and forth? I actually think about that first. Chris mentioned API. I think about the contracts. I know in the rest world they don't think about contracts or don't like that thing, but to me that's the best way to design an application. I think about it's a communication layer. One layer is talking to another one. What is the best way to talk to it? And then you get into security and other stuff as every application needs. So that's sort of what my driving force is. So I use the server for what makes sense for this use case.
So you talked earlier about the application, the client actually having all of the logic that it needed to make these to interact with the data, manipulate the data, right? So I think the example that you gave was modifying a bunch of clients or deriving from some information from a bunch of clients. So all of that. The way that you generally approach it is that all of that logic lives squarely on the client and not on the server, or do you kind of span it between the client and server, or?
So my rule of thumb is every layer has some layer of business logic, even the database.
Even the client, even the UI.
Well, definitely the UI, because that to me is the big difference between single page and traditional is I am moving a good chunk of my application to the client. And again, it all depends on what you're trying to do. If you have a very data-intensive, you're doing a lot of manipulation of data, you're doing a lot of calculations, you're more likely to have this than if it's a contact form, right? There's a spectrum like you were talking about before. It isn't a one-size-fits-all. So the way I look at it is, when I think about the server, I think about it from a data access point of view. So the server is the traffic cop, the guy who makes sure when data goes into the system, it's in a valid state. Okay.
Right.
So the client may make sure something's required. It does that and tells the user, hey, you've missed required fields. The server doesn't make an assumption the client did that work. It also does the stuff to make sure, hey, is this data in the right state? Did you provide a name, an address, or whatever it needs to be? So to me, the logic exists in both forms.
And that's really important, and I think in the future we'll probably go into the security of these kinds of applications, but just in the nutshell, it is really important what you said is that the reason why you're validating on the client is because you want a nice user experience, which was just your point from the beginning of all of this, but the reason you validate on the server is so that you don't, A, get bad data in by accident, but B, nefarious actors don't screw up your system on purpose. Yeah. Any request coming to that server doesn't necessarily come from your application, and that's a little subtle change from when you're used to programming what we would now call server-side frameworks, ASP.NET MVC, or Web Forms, PHP, where you said, oh, I'm in control of everything. Well, you are. You're still in control of everything. You're delivering the client you expect to the majority of your customers, but never forget that somebody sitting in Fiddler can just start hitting at your server, and you fear every single one of those requests and all of that input.
Yeah, your server should never trust inputs from the internet.
Nope. We'll never trust anything, even inside the intranet. The other thing to keep in mind too is because we're opening our applications up to be more of a data access type approach to it, it may be consumed by more than one client, right? You were talking before about maybe the mobile is a native mobile app. You may have a desktop, traditional web desktop that does its pieces of your application, but then you may have another piece that is your mobile application. You don't have to have one massive one-size-fits-all application. You could take advantage of whatever you're trying to do for those platforms.
So it's for that reason that the team I'm on now actually has kind of a rule. It's not exactly a rule, but it's kind of a guideline that we try to adhere to as much as possible, where we call it the 1+1 rule, right? You don't have any logic that's on the client that is more than like simple addition, right? 1 + 1 = 2. Anything beyond that, you're going back to the client to really figure out what to do. And so you're going back to the server to figure out what to do. And so the client is responsible for presenting an excellent user experience and nothing more. And so it gets data from the server in order to to present that experience. It interacts with the user. It receives inputs from the user, and that may affect what it kind of displays and everything. But ultimately, when there are operations that need to occur, when there are changes to the data or where there are inputs coming from the user, that gets sent right back to the client or right back to the server. And
now,
the server handles all of that. And so that is how we avoid duplicating our business logic, right? So our business logic lives squarely on the server and is excluding things like validation rules, which we are doing twice. We're validating on the client before we send them down, to Chris's point, just for user experience, right? So we don't have to make a full server trip to find out that you put in an invalid entry into this form. I can tell you that before, I can give you that feedback immediately within a split second before actually having to make a server call and say, oh yeah, sorry you waited 2 seconds. Now, that whole form is invalid because of these 20 things that I could have told you about 5 minutes ago. But other than that, it's the server that kind of dictates what to do next, and it dictates what is allowed to happen, and it often kind of dictates what you're able to do next, what you're allowed to do in that experience, and in that way we are able to facilitate a desktop application and perhaps a native application where the API is that the server API can facilitate both of those things. And we have to kind of duplicate. We have minimal duplication of actual business logic in the UIs. So the UIs are pretty thin.
So that's definitely possible, and if it makes sense for those applications, you definitely need to do it. But my experience is actually slightly different than that. I've been working on, for the last few years, pretty data-intensive applications where the UIs are very dynamic. They're actually configured elsewhere. And so the entire UI can change per user or per client. Client as not client machine, but client as the customer's client. And we have very intensive business rules where each cell in a grid, in order to be able to edit it, you have to check 30 rules. And based on what the data entry the user is doing, things change. So we definitely still have the server-side piece. It does what server-side has to do. It brings data from other systems and things like that. But the actual cell-level security, for example, that's driven by the client. Because if you had to go back to the server, everything, you'd be passing this massive state back and forth in order to check things.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, keep in mind, that's one of the big differences, too, I think we really haven't touched on today. The server is stateless. The client is stateful. That's, to me, the biggest advantage single-page applications bring to you as a developer. You have true state again. You can build a domain-driven design approach into your application without the overhead or the performance or scalability problems you'd have if you try to keep all that on the server.
So I consider what you just mentioned, validating those rules before you're able to, or executing those rules to figure out if you're able to edit a particular cell or something. That kind of falls under what I mentioned earlier of, driving the user experience, ensuring that the user is actually able to edit that cell before you even give them the option. That kind of thing, because the alternative would be just make every cell editable, and then you go and change it in the client, and then try and submit it back to the server, and the server says, "Oh no, you don't have access to that." That's a horrible experience, right? So that's the kind of stuff that I do need to know in the UI, but actually executing those changes, persisting those changes, that's the work of the server, right? And all of the logic, the business logic that actually goes into making those changes to the database or whatever it is that is storing that information.
Well, in the past, our server state was sometimes we would store it like in just like the session object, right? But then that didn't scale because you had to have some affinity to either that server, or you had to marshal that state from web server to web server. But like what you were saying, Todd, sounds to me is we've just moved that to the client, and so we actually scale because you, Todd, are connected to the application. You're managing the state right now for you. I'm not managing it, and nothing else in my web farm is managing it. And Jess, you're connected to my same application, and you're managing the state for you. Where in the past, we were trying to manage all that stuff using, frankly, stuff that didn't work very well, session state, and and trying to scale out servers by sharing session state and that madness.
Well, so is there still a place for that? So both of you have now said basically that the server side is stateless. It must be stateless. It has to be stateless. Is that one of the kind of rules that you follow, or is there a room for state on the server?
So for me, this gets back to what I said before, transient state. If it's transient, namely the data the customer's going to work on, I very rarely ever cache it on the server, unless there's some driving force to do that. So I pass that state back and forth. Because again, assuming the client's going to make changes to it, wouldn't make sense to keep it on the server, other than obviously in the database. But other kind of data, application type data, like the list of the states or the list of the companies or all that other kind of stuff, yeah, I still do cache a lot of that stuff on the server. But that, again, is more of a performance user experience driven thing.
Yeah.
I didn't want to go back to the database to get every list. So in the couple applications I've recently worked on, we actually have it where the client has that level of state and then saves to the server. And the idea is the cost to go from, again, we're getting back to the wire, client to server is so heavy that it's more efficient for each client to maintain their own state during that session. The whole concept of a session still exists on the client. But then when we have 1,000 customers come at once, we don't want each of them to go back to the server, the database server, so the state's also maintained there. But this is stuff that changes once a week or once a month.
So again, I think we have to kind of go back to the definition of state, right? So we're talking about state, and you just kind of started talking about what I would consider caching data, things like customers or states, countries, things like that. I would consider, when we're talking about stateful versus stateless services, I would consider like per user sessions, right? So for me as a user, I did these other actions in the past couple of minutes, and that kind of changed my state, and that's been persisted somewhere, be it in memory or in a database or something like things like Chris was just talking about, right? Like ASP.NET session state and things like that. So I mean, so my definition of a stateless server is basically things that don't have to depend on session state and those kinds of implementations. But I can certainly leverage the cache for optimization purposes.
Yeah, I explain it a little differently, but you explain it much better.
Okay.
Yes, to me, session state now exists on the client, and the client's responsible for saving that back to the server, or invoking the server to save it.
Yeah. Is that what you were going for, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, is it enables it makes new things possible. A little bit earlier, we touched on the idea of offline apps, where maybe either by accident or by design, you don't have an internet connection.
Yeah.
And so can the app still function? And I think in the early days of the web, we would all just assume like, well, that's the end.
Yeah.
That's all she wrote. But we're kind of getting to a place where, if you do this, it's a lot of work, but if you do it right, maybe I can still get some work done. And as long as it's work that fits a model of, I can update it later and that's okay, and it won't make you, the user, confused.
Yeah.
Because that's the key, is maybe I'm on an airplane and I say, well, I'm going to go ahead and send an email, or send a message of some kind, and as long as the UI properly presents to me that, look, this didn't happen right now. Yeah. And I don't know if you actually explicitly present that. This is where great design comes in.
Yeah.
Is it that you explicitly present that, or that the user gets the sense is, hey, I get it. You're going to fix this up for me when I land, but I still got some work done, and investing more heavily on the client side, which we're relying on the term SPA for. That gets you closer to that.
Yeah.
So what's interesting to me is, I was going to ask you folks, we haven't talked at all about how you actually go about building these things, and this is where the name dropping begins, right? The popular frameworks to use.
The religious war start again.
We've avoided all of that, which I think is good. We've kept it up at a theoretical level of why would you want to do this? Why would you want to build these apps this way? But the fact of the matter is, what do you both think about the time comes to build them? Are you going to roll your own JavaScript, or are you going to say, no, that's way too much investment. Some very smart people have built some frameworks for me? Which way would you go there, Jess?
So, yeah, I mean, the single-page applications, a lot of logic and immersive user experience using, JavaScript on the client has been around forever. I mean, we've been doing this for 15 plus years now. This is nothing new. Um, jQuery came around. What was it, 2004,
7 or so.
2005? Yeah, yeah, and mid 2005, something like that, and that became a huge boon for good user experience in the browser, at least better than we had before, just because it made it
Who's
so
better
easy.
developer experience?
Yeah, right. But so jQuery is a library that allows you to manipulate the DOM easily, right? And so when we're talking about spas and building applications, you can build an application with libraries like jQuery, but it still takes a whole lot of code, a whole lot of work. And so recently, within the past 5-ish, or more years, these SPA frameworks have come into vogue, right? And so these offer, now you're able to write a lot more business logic, focus on the business logic, less on working with the DOM and manipulating the DOM and cross-browser support and all of that stuff, and just focus on the code, the JavaScript that is your application, that is your user experience, and leverage a framework to take care of everything else. And so, I mean, the one real winner for me right now is that I consider the clear leader is Angular. And I have plenty of opinions on why that is. I've been using Angular for 2-3 years now, and like any framework, it's got its warts, it's got its pluses and minuses. But ultimately, it's definitely made me more productive in building these kinds of applications. And honestly, I don't really see it going anywhere because it's backed by Google and a huge community.
Yeah, which is quite important. I often tell people when they start out building these kind of applications, I refer to it as a JavaScript soup. Reminds me a lot of the Java world. There isn't a .NET framework sitting there in the browser for you, right? There's just the DOM to work with. Ultimately, whatever framework you pick, they're still using the DOM to do everything. It's just what is your level of abstraction? Very similar to .NET, right? I mean, we're not all writing pointers and things like that. We're writing .NET code. So because there's no standard framework, you have to make a choice. And depending on your application, Angular is a good choice for a good set of applications.
Oh, Angular is not the standard?
Well, that's interesting, though, right? It was a few years ago. I think if we go back a little bit, we're not going to have the timeline perfect here, but there were things like Knockout, which was not as opinionated or as complete as Angular, Backbone, and Ember and Durandal, and then, like you said, Angular has really, I mean, not only been on the rise. I agree with you, Jess. I don't think you're wrong at all to say that it has become a standard backed by a large percentage of the JavaScript development community. But just I think 12 months ago, I don't believe there was any such thing as Aurelia. And 18 months ago, I don't think we had yet heard of Facebook's React. So one thing I'm interested in is this is a fast-moving, churning space, and we're all asking ourselves, what are we going to be using in 18 months? Is it going to be these same things? So how does a development team, if we try to take this to work, how do we avoid getting paralyzed in worrying so much about, well, this is going to be gone in 6 months?
That is an excellent question. I think that is the question. And I think that is particularly, forget about the web. I mean, the web is the most important thing or the most popular thing right now. I mentioned I attribute a lot of that to mobile devices, tablets, and everything. But regardless of why, it's incredibly popular. And that is why I put so much emphasis on a solid server, right? Putting the application logic onto the server so that is there and it can be reused by multiple different clients. And so I mentioned earlier about native clients. Maybe I have a desktop client written in WPF or WinForms, and then a native iOS client written in Swift or whatever, and they're all hitting that same server backend. But if you make your views, if you make your UIs, if you make the things that run on the client as thin as possible, then it is easy to kind of throw them away and start over. And I know that's, a lot of people will call that heresy, but the the client moves forward very quickly. It always will, right? And it doesn't matter what the platform is. Today the hotness is mobile and web, but maybe the next is going to be HoloLens and Google Glass and things like that, right?
Or TVs, right?
Or TVs, right?
Yeah.
So the platforms, technology moves forward, right? Client technology, consumer technology is just always moving forward. And when we ask ourselves what frameworks are we going to be using in 18 months or 3 years or 5 years, we really need to be asking ourselves what technologies, what platforms are we going to be using in 5 years? And will these technologies, will these frameworks work on those, or will we need something else? And chances are, the really good chance is that even React, right? Even one of those things that is as cutting edge as React, where you can render a native application from JavaScript and HTML, even those kind of things may not be applicable to these new platforms in the future, and that should be okay. We should be able to just kind of abandon what we're doing now and implement a brand new brand new code base for a brand new platform, and it will be easy or easier. It won't be as painful because we can leverage all of that stuff that we put on the APIs on the server, and we just have to rebuild the experience, not the application logic.
So you hit on something kind of interesting that I wanted to comment on. So you said a lot about, all right, well, I'm going to put everything on this server so I can isolate myself from these changes. There is another piece to this puzzle. Whatever framework you use, whether it's Angular or React, whatever, that's still the UUI, right? That's the user interface. That's the grids, the charts, whatever you need to do. Whatever framework you use, if you isolate and build your application in a good, thought-out process, which works across desktops, mobile, whatever it is, and you have a true, I use the word domain model, that's the best way to describe it, you can write that in JavaScript and share it across the different frameworks. You don't have to, it isn't, I think the problem is we live in a world where we want to have it an or choice, and there isn't an or choice. When I build my applications, the first thing I think about is, how do I build it so the UI goes away?
Oh yeah, totally, Todd. I mean, one thing that I think about doing a lot, and you alluded to it with contracts, whether it's REST or something else, is that could I use the system, and that this doesn't mean in a web browser, can I use the system from Postman, which is just a Chrome application that lets me send, get, and post and put and delete requests to my web server? Could I use the whole thing from that? Painfully, yes. But if I can do that, then I've separated it from my views.
Yes.
And that, to me, is a really key part of building a single-page application correctly.
Right. I think that is the criteria. I think that's the test. That's the litmus test.
I would only add, though, that to me, that again, it really depends on the applications. The application I build, a lot of the stuff has to exist on the client, but we still isolate it away from the MVC or framework we're talking about. We build pure JavaScript classes that do the business logic. We can wire that up to any framework.
So when you're talking about leveraging JavaScript and creating a domain model in JavaScript, it seems like you're leveraging the fact that JavaScript is currently ubiquitous, that you'll be able to that makes it portable, right? That may not always be true.
Well, no, again, the driving force for this is the business requirements of the application. And a good domain model can be written in any language. It doesn't matter. It's actually language agnostic. That's the powerful part of that approach and stuff. So I guess the thing is, I kind of get the feeling you guys are still like, in order to solve the problem of how do I deal with frameworks, I'm going to push everything back to the server. And I think that's the wrong choice. The right choice is good quality design. You should design your system so that a framework can be removed and replaced. That's a separation concern, or whatever way you want to approach it. To me, being able to switch out a framework, there is cost. There's effort in doing that. But if you isolate your pure code, your application code, whether it's shared on a client or server or wherever you put it, you can achieve that. And I think that's the problem most developers have fought with or had a hard time grasping. We always wanted to do the code behind way, right? And guess what happens when you switch from WinForms to WPF or the JavaScript, whatever? Now I got to rewrite all that code because I've tied it too much to the client.
So I agree with you in theory, right? I agree with you that if you have abstracted everything properly, then I should be able to take my Angular application and convert it to React with relatively little change, right? But in practice, that's just not practical. Like I'm not going to take it. I'm not going to take my Angular application and with a little bit of work or even a lot of work just convert it over to Ember or the hot new framework. It's not realistic, right? But so I do follow where you're going with that, though. I think that the best frameworks just get out of your way and allow you to express your business logic and your domain model and all these things that we're talking about in pure JavaScript as much as possible, and then that JavaScript or whatever, that code, be it JavaScript today or whatever language tomorrow, that code runs within the framework. So you're not tying to the framework, and you're running within that framework. So but I put that on the framework, right? If the framework can get out of your way enough and provide you with enough scaffolding that you just kind of insert your code and the code isn't explicitly aware of and dependent on the framework, then the framework has done a good job. But that's not really true of any of the frameworks that I've used that I'm aware of, right?
I think Angular gives you a little bit of that, at least what I've seen more in the other frameworks. We use a small example like Knockout. In order to use Knockout, I have to kind of wrap things in certain ways.
Yeah.
Angular, I have to put things in certain places, but the things I put in there, I didn't need to wrap.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I can see another show. I can see another podcast where we actually kind of get into these specific frameworks and everything.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
But, I mean, I'm just kind of stating at a high level. These are the kind of criteria that I'm thinking of when I'm comparing these various frameworks. Right? We're kind of throwing out names here on the show and not really going into them, and that's
right.
Kind of kind of deliberate, right? But,
So I think back to Chris's original question: how do you convince your work to do things? I think the first thing you need to do is change the mentality. It's a human problem. It's not a technical problem. You can't be married to your framework. You're not going to be an Angular developer. You are going to be a web JavaScript developer who happens on application A because Angular solved that problem and you use Angular. You may use React or something else. I work in a number of cases where sometimes jQuery Mobile solves the problem I'm trying to use, and I just use that because it solves the problem I'm trying to use for what the use cases I'm trying to do. I need to be a JavaScript developer first, and then I tap into a framework when it makes sense. I also have to accept the fact it is going to change. What is the Agile rule? Embrace change. Yeah. That is quintessentially important.
I love that point, Todd, because I was just about to ask if this soup of names has made it easier or harder to hire people or put together teams. Because if you go back to when jQuery hit the landscape, the number one thing jQuery did was allowed us to unify our JavaScript code among the browsers, where before we were writing exceptions for IE and exceptions for Firefox, exceptions to deal with the DOM. jQuery brought that together. But then when we were forming our teams and we would hire, we'll just make it easy, 2 JavaScript developers. The one on the right, he liked to put the DOM together this way, and the one on the left, she liked to put it together a different way, and you didn't have any uniformity. The code wasn't consistent. It was hard to bring that together on a team. So I was just going to ask if this rise of frameworks has made it easier for you to form teams, but you began to answer it by saying, I'm not a framework developer, I'm a front-end developer.
Yes.
So when I hire for JavaScript developers, web developers. I completely agree with Todd. I'm a JavaScript developer first, right? And at that point, if I know JavaScript, if I know web development in general, and I understand, I'm not necessarily doing DOM manipulation all the time, but I understand what DOM manipulation is, why I need to do it, how it interacts with JavaScript and things like that, then the framework is kind of a side effect. Then I can sit down and I can teach my new hire AngularJS. If they've got the fundamentals of JavaScript and the DOM down, then it's relatively simple, or at least simpler, easier for them to sit down and learn the syntax of AngularJS as long as they understand the concepts already. So I don't expect anybody, as far as I'm concerned, if I'm working on AngularJS and I have a whole big project in AngularJS, it's a bonus, it's a plus if they actually know AngularJS. I'm looking for JavaScript developers.
Yeah, people know how to build apps. It's probably the biggest thing I have. There's lots of people who are JavaScript developers that can go work at WordPress. I need people who can build apps and happen to use JavaScript as their language of doing that.
Yep.
So, as far as getting companies to adopt this, I mean, we started out with we talked about things we're working on. This is sort of a thing I do a lot, is helping enterprises or companies in general understand the process, that change of going from only a .NET developer into this now web developer and whether it's Angular or whatever you need to do, and it scares people. People are very used to that Visual Studio experience and things. So it's also, I kind of think of, we talk about how do I hire people. Knowing JavaScript, knowing Angular, they're big pluses. But it's also that idea is I want people who aren't tied to a framework or aren't tied to a platform. They're like, hey, I can get in and figure out how to do this. So really smart people know how to figure shit out. And they're not going to be like, well,
and
I don't do
things
this.
done.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
If I can't write that C# code, I can't do the job. Well, okay, well then you're maybe better on being a backend developer. Or someone who's like, I'm a SQL Server guy, right? There's a term, I'm not going to drop a name now, but someone told me a long time ago, maybe 2005, polyglot programmers.
Yep.
The idea that you're not tied to a certain technology or framework. You are a developer programmer first. That's what I'm looking for.
So you both have said the same thing, which is that even though in future shows we're going to talk about different popular frameworks and how you get the most out of them, that you want people that don't just come to work to saying, I'm an Angular developer, I'm a React developer. It's I'm a web developer, and I'm going to put some investment time to keep up. Is that, how important is that for people listening to this podcast? Is you got to put some time in to invest and keep up with what's going on?
Yeah, well, and that's where I think the popularity of the framework is really important, is because that popularity will drive. Well, I mean, it's kind of a chicken and the egg issue, but the popularity will drive the blog posts and all of that external, and by external I mean outside of your company, outside of your team, all of those external learning resources. Where literally when I have, what I've been doing with my team is I say, because I have kind of a different way of doing it than what's out there on the blogs, but I say, go read all these blogs, right? Go read the Angular site, go read a bunch of blogs, read as much as you can on the internet in general about Angular, get all of those aspects and everything, and then I'll show you how we're doing it differently. Right, so get the big concepts, get the big ideas, be able to do it like everybody else says how you do it. And I'm not going to use the controllers and views and directives folders. We're going to have component-based folders, that kind of thing. But they've gotten the basics, they've gotten the fundamentals, the ideas of the framework down from the internet at large. I didn't have to sit down and teach them that.
Yeah, I say I agree. So you have the concepts, you have the basics to get down, and then for your organization, you do things one way. I'm as a consultant, so I have to deal with that across several different organizations, which is fun. And same day when you jump from company to company, it's like, wait, how do they do it here? So I think we touched on a lot of interesting points. We probably should start kind of summarizing back to the beginning of, we mentioned there's client stuff, there's server stuff, there's building single-page applications. Jess, like, how does someone get started with this? What does someone do they want to learn more about single-page applications? Is it just going to like Angular.com and downloading it, or is there some other place you think that maybe is a good starting point before they jump into the deep end of the pool?
I personally have a couple. So for my response is going to be Angular specific, but I mean, to make a more general response, you go, read the API documentation. Any good framework is going to have pretty good documentation, whether it's community supplied or project team supplied, and they're going to have a quick start, right? Go to the quick start, just the standard stuff. I've got no real innovative genius ideas here. Go and do the quick starts. But really just look into, try to map it to what you already know, right? If you're a jQuery developer coming into this, understand what jQuery helps you to do, what you've actually been doing with jQuery, that you've been doing DOM manipulation. And what is the DOM? The DOM is just the view. And now you're going to be learning an MVC framework, a model view controller framework, where the view is just a piece of that, and it's kind of tied to the model, and the controller. I mean, I think we'll get into that in future shows, right? But the controller kind of interacts and is the go-between between the model and the view, and just kind of understand that, right? And then like I said earlier, the syntax is almost secondary. Of course, you're going to need to learn the syntax for Angular and the API for Angular and what calls you need to do in order to accomplish something. But the more important thing to be thinking about when you approach any new framework, client-side or otherwise, is the concepts that it implements and how to leverage them, why you're leveraging them.
Well, awesome. We should take a look at frameworks and a little bit more digging into the nitty-gritty of how we might use them in Visual Studio or other editors.
Yeah, definitely.
So
the big question that I have for you guys is, you guys have both written, several applications, several single-page applications with some of these new frameworks. I know, all of us have written, quote-unquote single-page applications or just web applications, using jQuery and other frameworks for the past 10, 15 years. What have you seen in your experience is really kind of the pros of using a framework in practice in the real world, the pros of using a framework and some of the costs of it. Has it been a burden for any reason? What are the warts on just using a framework in general? Forget about specific frameworks, but just
the biggest positive is getting rid of boilerplate code. So what I mean by that is, just to keep it real simple, is we all love data binding. We loved it back in XAML and WPF. And why did we love it? Because time and again, we were writing code to go find the text box and pull the value out and transfer that over to some model. And things like Knockout introduced us to stop doing that. I'll put it in your model for you. Angular does that as well. But I'll give you a con, because this is actually, I think, a little bit harder, is you get one of these new modern frameworks that addresses the world. It doesn't just address an issue like data binding, it addresses everything. And so you start down the path of saying, well, it says that you do routing a certain way, let's try it. And I think one of the things that we've talked about, off the show is how, Jess, you're opinionated about Angular routing, and that many a developer will go down the path of thinking, well, this is the right way to do it because it's in the box.
Right. Yep. And
you would say, so I would say that's a con when you find out that something in the box doesn't work for you. Yeah, I won't make the blanket statement of it's awful, awful, terrible. When we do the Angular show, we can make that statement, right? but if it doesn't work for you, and you go down the rabbit hole of saying, well, gosh, it must be the right way because it's in the box and they've documented it and the Stack Overflow is filled with it. Mm-hmm. When do you finally give up going down the rabbit hole? Yeah. When do you realize that you need to turn back?
Yeah, I don't think I have an answer for that. That's a really, really good question.
It's a very loaded question.
Yeah. It's the big negative to me.
Yep.
Yeah.
No, I agree.
From my point of view, I look at it from two different ways. I can come into your organization. I can help you figure out how to build your application in pure JavaScript or jQuery, whatever you need to do. And Chris talked about this a little bit. You're going to write a lot of boilerplate code to make things work, all right? And then I'm going to create this wrapper framework that does a bunch of stuff for you, and then I'm going to leave. And then you have no documentation. You have no way of – you'd have to basically hire me to solve your problems. One of the things to me that frameworks bring to the table more than anything else, and this is across all the spectrum of platforms and things, is there is a community, whether it's driven by Microsoft or Google or whoever, it isn't a custom solution for you. It exists for everything. So Chris talked about it as being a negative. That's actually potentially a positive too, that there is a community, things from Stack Overflow, whatever, to be able to learn how to do these things, right? A new developer adds to your team, you tell them, here, go off and read these set of books, or read these courses and things, and you can quickly get up to speed. Versus if it's a total custom solution to you, then you have to sit there and the developer and actually walk him through, well, here's how you created a screen that does this, this, and this. So to me, having a framework provides that foundation for them to get started. And there are drawbacks, like what Chris was talking about with, hey, how do I deal with the routing that doesn't work for me? My general rule of thumb is proof of concepts first. Prove that routing done in Angular this way solves your problem. Separate it, isolate it, and then once you know what works on, you move on. Don't wait 6 months in to say, hey, that doesn't work for me, so let's throw the whole framework away.
Yep.
The other thing I think is, and this is more to do with the bigger problem. So people often ask me, well, Angular doesn't perform well, or the framework doesn't perform well. It's not the framework that's the problem. The browsers themselves still are a big problem.
Right, especially in mobile, right?
Yes. Well, mobile's even a whole other spectrum. We're trying to jam a solution on top of piece of shit, basically. Web browsers were never designed to do what we're trying to do. Frameworks, jQuery first, and now we're getting to Angular and React and all these other things. They're making it easier for us to build things, and the browsers are getting smarter and more intelligent. But ultimately, developers have to understand how they work. We talked about the DOM before, right? You still have to understand you're still working with the DOM. And you have memory management now to worry about. Probably the biggest thing I've come across is, and there isn't a good solution, unfortunately, is now I've moved all the state to the client, I have to now worry about memory. I can't fire up 4,000 objects and then expect the browser not to blow up. I have to be a little more smarter about things. Now, that problem always existed. It just, when I build a SPA application, it becomes a bigger problem to be faster. So I have to learn how to deal with it.
Yeah. No, I agree.
So,
do you want to take it, Chris? Chris and I are in another chat kind of talking about wrapping it up.
Yes. I was trying to figure out how to get there. So,
I think that's so.
Going back to the episode format, right? The next is like kind of, I think that's the wrap up, right? And then I think we should do maybe some next steps, right? Like how do we make this information actionable at all? And I think literally just kind of go like we did in the beginning, just kind of do ask around. And I was going to let Chris kind of drive that, open it up.
Yeah, well, for me, the next call to action for me would be, okay, so we've talked a lot about how this is a good way to design modern web apps.
Are we recording or are we?
I've been recording.
Yeah, I didn't turn it off.
No. I mean, are we? I was going to kind of cut this part out. I was going to let you lead in, a little bit more.
Yeah, but I don't remember where we left off. You'll have to be creative with your editing.
No, I think just kind of jump into. We left off with a pause. We left off with Todd talking about DOM, and I said I agree, and a pause. So I think we can pick up and do whatever the hell we want right now.
Okay. Yes. Well, then yeah, right. Then let me go. Right. So. Yeah. So as a developer who's used to living in Visual Studio, I think the next question for me would be, there's no file new project that comes up with Angular or Aurelia or React.js. So figuring out how we want to lay these things out, I think, is a great topic for us to look at, that we can start exploring each of these different frameworks. And then folks listening to this podcast, I think that you guys would both agree that they'll want to stay tuned as we begin to dive into how a .NET developer is going to get the most out of what's popular out there right now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the best way to kind of get started with all of this is to really see for yourself the differences between the frameworks, right? Just go through each of the really popular frameworks. If you've heard about it, or if it's at the top of a Google search, right, then go ahead and take a look at it and just run through that getting started application yourself. I mean, the choice of tooling, Visual Studio or Sublime Text or Visual Studio Code, it generally just doesn't even really matter. Anything that you're comfortable with writing JavaScript and HTML in, that'll work. But really, just go through that getting started application and just get a feel for it. That's not going to give you the depth that you need, right? It's not going to give you the full-blown routing and all of those advanced features that do tend to kind of differentiate the frameworks, but you can at least get a feel for how the framework makes you feel, right? I'm very kind of touchy-feely with this stuff, but it's important, right? Does it make it easy for you? Does it match the way that you think about building applications? Those are the kinds of things that you're looking at, and you can get that pretty easily.
Let me jump in real quick. You talk about something that's kind of important. It also gets back to the idea of not being married to a framework. Explore different frameworks. See which one works for you. If Angular is everything that makes sense for you, hey, go on that path. If Ember is something else that makes more sense for you, or it's easier for you to get, if you just come to this, don't let the framework get in the way. Learn how to build these type of applications. Utilize the framework to make your job easier. Once you've grasped one, it's much easier than to jump to another one, where if you're starting from scratch.
Yeah.
I used to always tell people to start with Knockout because I think it has this most amazing documentation, more than the rest. So
Yeah,
that's why I usually.
documentation is huge. But you know what? I think really the best advice I can give is we are going to have a couple more shows,
Yes.
and we're going to dive into some specific frameworks, and we can kind of elaborate on our opinions on them. So
Yep.
that would be the best advice I can give. So stay tuned.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So it sounds like a show. I guess we can we can wrap up now. So before we go, I just want to ask you, the listener, your review is really huge in helping other people find the podcast. We're a brand new podcast. We're just trying to get off the ground, and we're trying to gain a following. So if you could jump onto iTunes and give us some good feedback, that'll really help other people find it and help us reach some more people. Also, you personally, just to kind of stay up with news and everything, if you go to our website, staticvoidpodcast.com, you can sign up as a member there, and we'll keep you up to date on everything, and including new episodes. And if you like this podcast, nothing beats word of mouth. Please tell your friends about us. That is how we are going to gain new listeners, is you and your friends. And with that, thank you. I hope it's been valuable. Thank you for spending your time with us.
Awesome.
Get you next time.
Yep. See ya. All right, that was good. Hour and 8 minutes. I think I can chop a handful of stuff out. I can bring it under an hour. I think not 45 minutes, but I can bring it under an hour.
Well, I think we did good keep it to our format and transitioning to things.
What?
I think we did good in keeping the format and transitioning.
Well, hold on, I'm going to stop
Not going too far off the rails.